Look, imagine a world where the idea of individual freedom, democracy, and philosophy simply vanished. That was the grim reality facing the tiny Greek city-states when the Persian Empire, the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful empire the world had ever seen, marched west. This wasn't a fair fight. It was an existential threat to freedom itself. How could a massive, professional army be beaten by scattered citizen soldiers? And how did a tiny fleet manage to destroy the largest navy ever assembled? What strategic errors did the superpower make? And most importantly, what would our modern world look like if that small Greek coalition had failed? These are massive, fundamental questions that define the history we live in. They challenge the very nature of power, strategy, and human will. In this video, we are going to answer all these questions, exploring every detail of the background, the terrifying events, the strategic analysis, and the monumental consequences of freedom's first, greatest stand. So, let's start. Now we are going to discuss the precise reasons why this war happened. Analyzing the background in detail. The conflict wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the culmination of decades of friction between two fundamentally incompatible political and economic systems. We can identify three deep-seated forces that guaranteed this war would happen. The first and most expansive force was imperial ambition and geopolitical expansion. The Persian Empire, having conquered the wealthy Ionian Greek cities along the coastline of modern-day Turkey, simply saw the rest of the Aegean Sea, meaning the Greek mainland, as a necessary part of securing their western frontier. Driven by the belief that their empire must touch and control every accessible coastal region to secure trade routes and prevent incursions. The conflict was less about conquering poor soil and more about establishing absolute control over the sea. The second force was ideological incompatibility. The Persian system was based on absolute monarchy, massive tribute collection, and centralized decree, allowing local customs only insofar as they served the great king. The rising Greek system, particularly in Athens, was moving towards self-governance, trait-based wealth, and individual political participation, a model that was anarchic and dangerous in the eyes of the great king. Their political models were simply unable to coexist on the same strategic frontier without eventual conflict. The third force, which served as the actual catalyst, was the Athenian affront. This was the decisive moment. In 499 BC, the Ionian Greeks living under Persian rule rebelled. They sent desperate pleas for help to the mainland, and Athens, a burgeoning naval power, foolishly agreed to send 20 ships to aid the revolt. During that revolt, the Athenian forces committed the symbolic and reckless act of burning the Persian regional capital, Sardis, to the ground. This wasn't merely a military action. It was a devastating personal insult and an act of defiance against the very divinity of the great King Darius. The historical record shows that Darius was so enraged that he commanded a servant to repeat the phrase, "Master, remember the Athenians," 3 times before every meal. This established that the campaign against the mainland Greeks was not simply about conquest. It was about exacting divine retribution and vengeance for an insult that threatened the majesty of the entire empire. Once that insult was delivered, the war became absolutely inevitable. With that background of unyielding ambition and personal insult in mind, let's move on to the actual incidents that defined the wartime. The conflict unfolded in 2 massive waves of invasion. The first wave occurred in 490 BC when Darius dispatched a punitive expedition led by his general Datis, who successfully destroyed the city of Eretria as a harsh warning to the Greeks. The Persian army then landed on the plains of Marathon, just a short march from Athens. This was the moment of truth for the Athenians, who were isolated and outnumbered by the Persian forces. The Athenian general Miltiades, knowing that fighting in the open would be suicide, made a bold, unconventional tactical choice. He deliberately weakened the center of the Greek hoplite line and heavily reinforced the 2 wings. When the battle began, the Persian center easily pushed through the thin Greek center, but as they advanced, they found themselves completely encircled and overwhelmed by the powerful, disciplined Greek flanks. The Persians, finding their formations broken and their lighter wicker shields and linen armor useless against the tight hoplite phalanx and bronze shields, were utterly routed. This shock victory, achieved with minimal Greek losses and massive Persian casualties, proved two things. Firstly, that the Greek military system was superior in a frontal clash, and secondly, that the Persian army was not invincible. The second, far larger and more terrifying wave began 10 years later in 480 BC under Darius's son, Xerxes. This campaign required the mobilization of the entire empire's resources. Xerxes' logistical preparations were legendary. He had his engineers spend years constructing a monumental pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, spanning the strait using hundreds of ships lashed together. And he also ordered the construction of a canal through the Athos Peninsula just to prevent a storm disaster that had ruined his father's previous fleet. The Greeks, facing this overwhelming force, decided to hold the line at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the mountains met the sea, forcing the Persians to fight in a tight column. The Greek land defense was led by the Spartan king Leonidas with his famous 300 Spartiates and several thousand allied troops. For 2 full days the Greek phalanx held the line, using their discipline and heavy armor to inflict horrific casualties on the waves of Persian infantry and elite units. Their sacrifice became necessary when a local Greek trader, Ephialtes, revealed an obscure mountain goat path that allowed a contingent of Persian troops to outflank the defenders. Leonidas, knowing the trap was sprung, dismissed the bulk of the Greek forces, including the crucial Phocian guards, to save them for future battles, staying behind with his disciplined corps to fight to the last man. While Leonidas held the land, the Athenian navy, led by the brilliant strategist Themistocles, was fighting a holding action at Artemisium against the massive Persian fleet, successfully fulfilling its mission to protect the army's flank and ensuring the total encirclement of the Greek forces was avoided. The pivotal moment arrived shortly thereafter, the Battle of Salamis. Following Thermopylae, Xerxes captured Athens and burned the empty city to the ground. The entire Athenian population had evacuated to the small island of Salamis. The fate of Greece now rested entirely on Themistocles and the small Greek fleet. Themistocles executed a brilliant psychological deception, sending a trusted servant to Xerxes with a false message claiming the Greeks were panicked and planning to flee overnight. Xerxes, impatient and eager for the final crushing victory, took the bait. He ordered his entire massive fleet to seal both entrances to the narrow strait of Salamis, surrounding the Greeks and preparing for battle at dawn. When the battle began, the Persian ships, packed tightly in the narrow channel, became hopelessly disorganized. Their superior numbers became a fatal liability. The smaller, faster Greek triremes struck with devastating effectiveness, employing sophisticated naval maneuvers like the Deiplas breaking through the line, and Periplas outflanking and attacking the sides or rear, to dismantle the enemy fleet piece by piece. Xerxes watched the entire catastrophe unfold from his throne on a cliff overlooking the bay. In a single day, the backbone of the Persian naval power was broken. Xerxes lost hundreds of ships, and critically, he realized he could no longer sustain or supply his massive army on European soil, forcing him to retreat with the majority of his forces. The final land battle of the war took place the following year at Plataea, where the unified Greek army, led by the Spartan general Pausanias, utterly destroyed the remaining Persian forces under Mardonius, ending the threat for good. After these momentous incidents, we need to discuss what the immediate result of the war was. The immediate outcome was the complete and total expulsion of the vast Persian army and navy from the Greek mainland. The Greek city-states were free, their independence secured, and the Persian Empire's westward ambitions were permanently checked. Moreover, the war had 2 critical and immediate domestic results that reshaped the Greek world. Firstly, Athens rose to undeniable naval supremacy. Having supplied the majority of the ships and the decisive strategy at Salamis, Athens used this prestige to dominate the Aegean. Secondly, this naval power and prestige led directly to the formation of the Delian League, an alliance structure initially meant to guard against future Persian attacks, but which quickly became the vehicle for Athenian imperial control, demanding tribute paid in ships or silver from nearly every Greek city around the Aegean, and laying the foundation for the next great conflict, the Peloponnesian War. But why did the result look like this? How could a divided collection of states defeat the most powerful empire on earth? Now we are going to analyze this. The unexpected outcome was due to a complex confluence of tactical, strategic, and political factors. The victory was driven by three main reasons. Firstly, superior discipline and weaponry. The Greek hoplite and the phalanx formation, fighting with heavy bronze armor, large bronze shields and long spears, was militarily unmatched by the lighter armored Persian infantry, who often relied on bows and wicker shields. The phalanx fought as a single, coordinated, devastating unit, a discipline forged by constant training and intercity conflict. Secondly, the strategic genius of the Greek commanders, who understood the need to use geography. By deliberately forcing battles into narrow choke points, such as Thermopylae on land and the Strait of Salamis at sea, the Greeks neutralized the Persian advantage in overwhelming numbers, ensuring it became a battle of quality versus quantity. The Persian advantage in cavalry and sheer manpower was rendered irrelevant in these tight confines. Thirdly, the most potent factor, the motivation of the Greek citizen soldier, who was fighting not for a distant emperor or for tribute, but for his home, his family, and his newly discovered freedom, was an engine of desperate courage the Persian conscripts, many of whom were fighting far from their homes under foreign rulers, simply could not match. But the result could have been changed just as easily. The analysis must also show how the outcome could have been different. The result could have been changed in two major ways. Firstly, if the Persian fleet had simply avoided the narrow trap at Salamis, using their massive numbers to blockade the Greeks and wait them out instead of forcing a decisive engagement, the Greek population trapped on the island would have starved, forcing a total, unconditional surrender without a major battle. Secondly, if the Greeks had failed to unite and the Spartans, or the Athenians had accepted Xerxes' separate peace offers, which were quite generous, the coalition would have dissolved. If one major power had broken ranks, Persia would have conquered the remaining states individually, changing the entire history of the Mediterranean. Now that we understand the strategic reasons for the Greek victory, we must examine the huge impact this result fell on both the country and in the area, and also in the whole world. The long-term consequences of this single conflict are almost impossible to overstate. The impacts were felt on three major levels. Firstly, the impact on Persia was that it marked the psychological and geographical limit of their expansion. This defeat consumed massive amounts of imperial wealth and resources, leading to a long period of internal political instability and distrust of regional governors, ushering in a slow, centuries-long decline in Persian military confidence, particularly when dealing with the West. Secondly, the impact on the Greek area was immense. It triggered the famous Golden Age of Athens. The wealth, confidence, and naval supremacy gained created the foundation for democracy, philosophy, architecture, and theater that defined classical antiquity. This period saw the construction of the Parthenon, the philosophical inquiries of Socrates, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, and the creation of tragedy and comedy. This intense, unparalleled period of creativity would not have occurred without the crucible of the Persian Wars to forge the Athenian spirit and provide the resources necessary for such massive public works. Thirdly, and most crucially, the impact on the whole world was that the victory allowed the continuous tradition of rational inquiry, individual liberty, and democratic principles, what we now call Western civilization, to survive and flourish. Had Persia won, the Mediterranean would have become a satellite of the Near East, suppressing those unique Greek ideas and fundamentally changing the political and philosophical roots of the modern world. The world would have been ruled by kings, not by citizen assemblies. Before we conclude, we must ask the contemplative question: could this war have been avoided, and what would have happened if this war never happened at all? The war could have been avoided primarily had Athens and Eretria never interfered in the Ionian Revolt. Without that direct personal insult to the great King Darius, the Persian Empire might have paused its expansion at the Hellespont. Seeing the resource-poor Greek peninsula as too much trouble to conquer, choosing instead to focus on internal consolidation and control of the Black Sea trade. It was the insult, more than the pure ambition, that truly committed Xerxes to the invasion. So, what would have happened if this war never occurred? The greatest impact would be that the golden age of Athens would not have occurred. Without the immediate existential threat and the naval wealth gained from the victory, Athens would likely have remained a secondary city-state, politically and militarily overshadowed by a land power like Sparta. The intense rivalry and creativity that spurred their democratic experiment would have been greatly diminished. The result would be a Hellenic world that was politically fragmented, less unified culturally, and ultimately less influential globally. The ideas of democracy and philosophy might have survived, but they likely would not have spread and taken root in the foundational way they did. It was the victory that forged the identity of the West. The defeat would have snuffed out that bright flame of freedom before it could truly illuminate the world.